Joining us now, NYU law professor, former White House counsel in the Obama administration, and co-author of Executive Functions on Substack, a newsletter devoted to the analysis of presidential and broader executive power issues, Bob Bauer. Bob, good to have you. Let's talk about expectations here. I think there's a lot of people that don't know how much of what Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail is talk, how much what Steve Bannon has been said about going after people is talk, or what Kash Patel has said about going after people is talk, and how much of it's actually going to come to fruition. It's a really weird place to be unsure of what to expect in terms of the prosecutorial power that this new team will be wielding in just a few days.
Yes, and of course, over the course of our history, there's been a consensus across Democratic and Republican administrations that the Department of Justice, while it has to be loyal, if you will, committed to the president's governing program, must conduct law enforcement in an impartial manner, free of both the appearance and the fact of political influence. And the question is, given what Donald Trump has said about loyalty, given the number of times he has threatened the prosecution of political adversaries, whether the people now coming to these posts are going to be able to uphold that tradition. And you saw that, as your correspondent just said a minute ago, being the focus of the questioning of Attorney General Bondi. And I think it'll be the focus of the questioning of the other senior department officials who are coming up for confirmation in the weeks ahead.
You're also going to have folks giving advice to Donald Trump on orders he may be issuing. You're going to have a White House counsel team that will tell him, presumably, what's legal and what's not. And one of the things they would have advised him on back in 2016 was whether it was legal to direct the Pentagon to shoot protesters, which, Mark Esper has said he was ordered to do, which he did not do. Pete Hegseth was asked about that by Mazie Hirono. We have this soundbite, and I'd love to play it for you just so we can remind ourselves of this moment in Pete Hegseth's confirmation just a couple days ago.
In June of 2020, then President Trump directed former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper to shoot protesters in the legs in downtown D.C., an order Secretary Esper refused to comply with. Would you carry out such an order from President Trump?
Senator, I was in the Washington, D.C. National Guard unit that was in Lafayette Square during those events.
Would you carry out an order to shoot protesters in the legs?
I saw 50 Secret Service agents get injured by rioters trying to jump over the fence, set the church on fire, and destroy a statue.
That sounds to me that you will comply with such an order. You will shoot protesters in the leg.
Bob, that is, that's something that a lot of Americans would be concerned about if they're protesting and Donald Trump doesn't agree with the protest. Is Pete Hegseth, if he gets confirmed, the kind of guy who would send that order on down? And he waffled on that. He wouldn't be clear on that. The White House council of lawyers that Donald Trump's going to have, along with the DOJ set of lawyers, what's your expectation on the advice that they would be giving him on something like that if it came to pass?
You're quite right. The White House counsel plays a critical role. Let me just stress one thing. Every White House counsel knows that every senior DOJ official knows that we can have norms, we can have rules, we can have policies, but they have to be implemented. People in charge have to see that they are honored in full and apply those norms in particular cases faithfully and effectively. And I'll just point out, the White House counsel is the author, and you saw some testimony on this topic during the hearing, of the so-called contacts policy. There are very specific requirements for communications between the White House and the Department of Justice, that is to say, by policy adopted in administrations, both Democratic and Republican. In January of 2017, Donald Trump's first White House counsel, Don McGahn, put out a memorandum very similar to ones that had been issued by prior administrations, in effect saying that the Department of Justice and the White House have to collaborate to ensure that the public is confident that criminal investigations, criminal cases that the department brings or chooses not to bring, are handled in a fashion that are free of political influence. That's in the Trump's first administration, President Trump's first administration. So the question is, will we have a team at the White House and the Department of Justice who will put the same commitment to those principles before the American public and then implement them faithfully? The Attorney General designate or nominee Pam Bondi said yesterday there would be a contacts policy. The thing to keep an eye on is how it's written and who will be confirmed to see that it is honored.
There's also the wrinkle of the Supreme Court ruling that has given the executive immunity for any conversations he might be having with his attorney general, which lowers, if not outright eliminates, a guardrail. So if Donald Trump's saying, I don't like Liz Cheney, or if he's saying, I don't like Adam Schiff, or he's saying, I don't like Kinzinger, or if he's saying, I don't like this media host, or if he's saying, I don't like this protester, whatever it is, whatever person that might be deemed a threat from within, what is the immunity decision? How does that play?
The president, again, by opinions that were issued across different administrations, any president has enjoyed immunity while in office from criminal prosecution, not from investigation, but from prosecution. What the Supreme Court has made very clear now is that that immunity attaches to any communications that the president has on officially related matters with senior members of the Department of Justice, or with anybody for that matter in the Department of Justice. And that creates, I think, additional pressure on the people who advise the president to ensure that these principles and traditions are honored in fact, and that rests with the fidelity to law of the people who hold these positions and their commitment to basic norms, even beyond what those laws require. It's all going to be a question of those in those positions of responsibility taking those responsibilities seriously.
Bob Bauer worked as a White House counsel, also a lawyer for President Biden as well, personal side of things. Bob Bauer, thank you very much.